a leather chair, china tableware, alcohol, golf carts, tubas, and lobster tails have in common? Those are just a few of the things the federal government spent $97 billion on during the 2018 fiscal year's final month. The money is spent as part of the yearly use it or lose it spending phenomenon, when federal agencies scramble to expend as much of what's left in their annual budgets as possible. OpenTheBooks.com compiled in their annual report what exactly the federal government used their nearly $100 billion on. Here to explain more is the CEO and founder of OpenTheBooks.com, Adam Andrzejewski. Thank you for being here, Adam.
Great to be on the program, Julia. It's great to be here in studio with you.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us. So just to get started with, explain a little bit about what OpenTheBooks.com does and what was really done to compile this report.
So our mission at OpenTheBooks.com can best be summarized with the description of every dime online in real time. Our mission is literally to capture every dime taxed and spent at every level of government across the entire country. That includes not only the federal level, but also the state and local level. And we've had a lot of success on data capture. We've built the world's largest private database of public sector expenditures. Just last year, we filed 60,000 Freedom of Information Act requests. And for instance, we captured nearly every single public employee's salary record and pension record from every public body in the country, 22 million records, which we display on our website.
Okay, and just delving a little deeper into this report, I mean, the findings are really astounding to me. On average, the federal government spent $3.2 billion a day on contracts throughout the month of September. So explain to me a little more what you found and how much money these government agencies are spending.
So this use it or lose it phenomenon, it's when the agency heads of these departments, they spend down their budgets this year so they get the same or more from Congress on appropriation for next year. And what we found in September of 2018, the last month of the fiscal year, the federal agencies, as you mentioned, spent $100 billion, $97 billion out of their budgets in that final month. In the last week, it was $53 billion went out the door. And that's equivalent to 1 out of every 9, 1 out of every $10 spent on contracts on the year flowed out the door in the last week.
And just to clarify, so the remainder of this money is essentially they scramble to spend this money on maybe what many would say are useless things, such as, the lobster tails, the tubas, a lot of what people in this town would call luxuries, like very swamp-like, if you will.
So let's go through that laundry list. You mentioned the china tableware. Well, on the year, federal agencies spent $125,000 on these fancy dishes. But in the last month of the fiscal year, they spent about half of that, $53,000 buying the fancy dishes. They spent $750,000 on golf carts. On the year, they spent $1.6 million, and about $700,000 went out the door on golf carts in the last month. On musical instruments, they spent $1.7 million. They spent $250,000 on grand pianos, $70,000 on trombones. And it was all comprised on instruments, $1.7 million. What we found particularly interesting was what the Department of Defense spent on lobster tail and snow crab. So in the last month, they spent nearly $5 million on lobster tail and snow crab. Now, just on lobster tail alone, we dug deeper at OpenTheBooks.com. We went through the federal spending data, and they spent $22 million on lobster tail last year. Over the course of the last 4 years, the Pentagon has spent roughly $55 million on lobster tail.
So that's just so surprising to me. We hear the president talk about what he calls a crisis at the southern border, a threat from ISIS, terrorism threats abroad. But it just seems so odd that the Pentagon is spending what seems to be a big bulk of their budget on lobster tails and these other luxuries. I mean, can you just delve a little deeper into that comparatively, I guess, what they're spending on what are their national security necessities versus these minute luxuries, if you will?
So the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, they were the biggest offender of the use it or lose it phenomenon, spending down their budget. They spent roughly $62 billion billion in the last 30 days of the fiscal year to spend down the budget. On an annual basis, they spend about $250 billion on the year in contracts. So this was a big portion of their annual contract spend at the DoD. And, most of it was spent on fixed-wing aircraft or ships and vessels, and we can appreciate that. Or $1 billion was spent on guns, ammunition, and bombs of different sorts, and missiles. However, we did find some troubling items in addition to the lobster tail. For instance, they spent nearly $10,000 on a Wexford club leather chair. And I think taxpayers would feel a lot better about this rush to spend money if we felt it was spent properly. But as you know, Julia, the Pentagon, they had their first ever audit last year, 1,200 auditors. They spent the year auditing. They spent about $500 million on their audit, and they flunked it.
Wow. And have you heard any sort of reaction from the Pentagon or other agencies on this report? I mean, what is their line of defense right now?
So we haven't reached out yet this year to them. In years past, they've remained silent when media organizations like NPR, we worked with NPR in 2017 to launch our Use It or Lose It report last year. They reached out to them, and they never responded in time to make the news articles.
Wow. And, my last question is President Trump campaigned on a message of draining the swamp, and we've seen other politicians from both sides of the aisle say they want to get rid of the big spending in Washington, want to get rid of the corruption in Washington, really try to connect more with the average American living outside of the Beltway. What do you hope the report does to kind of make sure they stay true to that message?
Well, we have urged the president as commander-in-chief from the perch of the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. We've published open letters to the president urging him to declare war on federal waste. We've outlined a three-pronged strategy of open the books, cut at least 5%, and he's embraced that cut last fall, but then report to the American people on the progress or lack of progress on that war on waste. We hope this report shows the president, who I think has good instincts on spending, coming from the private sector, to show that he's serious on cutting that 5%. Right now, we're hearing that his agency secretaries don't believe he's serious. The Democrats in Congress don't believe the Republicans anymore, because in the last 2 fiscal years, the Republicans, when they controlled Congress, they hiked discretionary spending by $300 billion.
And, I think this administration has faced a lot of blowback for the spending of many of their cabinet secretaries, whether it was Ben Carson decorating his office or, former Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke traveling abroad on private airplanes. Have you heard any reaction from the administration on a report on this report or prior reports?
So we heard from Mick Mulvaney when he was head of management and budget, that when our open letter to the president in the Wall Street Journal was placed on the Oval Office desk, and it helped galvanize the president's order to the cabinet secretaries to cut 5%. To the extent that we had an influence on that policy, we're proud. Now's the time for the president to really get serious. As you mentioned, he promised on the campaign trail, signature promise, to drain the swamp, and unless he gets his hands around the waste, that promise rings hollow.